While we wait for others to trickle in, let's start with Nigun, and then we'll begin learning together. Passing to others. Maybe.
Anybody need one now? My pleasure.
Okay. Good Shabbos again.
Good Shabbos.
So before we turn to the text itself, I just want to address an obvious tension on this particular Shabbat in this tumultuous time, that right now there are other members of this community and other communities marching and protesting and so forth. And I think it's worth just raising it as a question, particularly as we are studying the works of Heschel, about when and where and how and why and with whom we engage in such activities. And I certainly am not passing judgment one way or the other, but it would feel strange to me not to begin by saying it is on the one hand Shabbat, and we are in Beit Knesset, and Torah and Tefillah are vital. On the other hand, we are living in the midst of chaos, and we need to ally and work together and affirm and protest. So we'll just hold that tension, and perhaps we'll come back to it as part of our learning and conversation this afternoon. I don't want to resolve it or attempt to do so now. Let's go into the text, and then we'll come out of that, and this may remain a question. It may, in fact, be enhanced. But let me frame what's in front of you by saying the following. Heschel obviously is iconic in the Jewish community and well beyond at this point. He was born in 1907 and died in 1972, which means that he actually did not live a very long life by the standards of his own time and certainly today. When you look at pictures of him, mostly beard, he looks like he could have been, Mea ve'esrim, 120, but he was 65 years old. Part of the reason why he looked so old is because he lived a very difficult, challenging, and full life in that rather brief period. He was born in Warsaw. As you may know, he was the Einikel, which means that he was the offspring of several generations of Hasidic masters, going all the way back to the beginnings of the movement. In fact, at his bar mitzvah, he wore the tefillin of Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev. Wow. That was one of the great honors that he recalled at his bar mitzvah. Wow. So he was related to Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev and a whole slew of other rebbes. By the time his father served as a rebbe, Moshe Mordechai Heschel, they were a very poor family, serving a very impoverished Jewish community in Hasidic Warsaw. And Heschel was identified at a young age as an Ilui, as a prodigy. He was the fifth of 5 children. He was the youngest boy. He had 3 older sisters and an older brother. And if you are identified as an Ilui, and you are the youngest boy in a Hasidic family, the hope and the expectation of everyone in the family and the community is that you will be the next Rebbe. And that was particularly alive for the Heschel family and for the Hasidic community, because remember that in 1907 in Warsaw, there were many options in terms of Jewish life. And in fact, many young Hasidim, including members of his extended family, were opting to leave. And in Warsaw, you could be a Hebraist, a Yiddishist, a Zionist, a territorialist. You could be any number of variety of Jewish identities. And Hasidism was frankly waning in that time and period. And in Heschel's case, his father passed away when Heschel was just short of his 10th birthday. And that was a major tragedy. He died of influenza. That was the period of, the flu sweeping through the world, as you know. World War I, II was a terribly disorienting and painful time. Heschel was fortunate in that his uncle, who you can see on the second page, the flip side, the little man that looks like he could be Heschel in Hasidic garb, that was the Rebbe from Novominsk. And even though he began his career in Novominsk and then lived in Warsaw, he was forever the Rebbe from Novominsk. He took it upon himself to educate Heschel. He saw him as a prodigy, and though this Rebbe, his uncle, had 10 of his own children, some of whom, in fact, left the Hasidic fold, he invested a lot of time and energy in Heschel. And one of the ways in which we know that symbolically is that people who visited the Tish of the Novominsker on Shabbos afternoon reported that young Heschel always sat by the side of the Rebbe. And the Tish in the Hasidic context is considered a sacred gathering. It's an opportunity to hear Torah, to eat with the Rebbe, to sing with the Rebbe, etc. It's interesting, however, that at the Novominsker's Tish on Shabbos afternoons, Heschel actually met a very interesting array of people, some of whom were ex-Hasidim who still had affection and warmth towards elements of Hasidic life, so they would come back to the Tish. And then, as he began to explore Warsaw as a teenager, quietly at first, not letting his uncle or his mother know exactly what he was up to, he would meet some of those same people in coffee houses. And so he was moving between worlds. And that was not uncommon, but was certainly cause for concern in the Heschel family. At a certain point, after his bar mitzvah, after he had received smicha, at 14 or 15, after he'd started to publish his first halachic responsa, he really fell in love with philosophy and poetry and art history. None of the things that one studied in yeshiva at any length, and certainly not the curriculum of a Rebbe in training. But he was determined. He was a very self-motivated young man who had a voracious appetite for learning and growth, for intellectual and cultural life. And so, with the permission of his family, there was a conclave of Rebbes that came together. They allowed him to leave Warsaw and to go to a gymnasium in Vilna, which was an 8-hour train ride away. And in fact, Heschel used some money that he made from publishing his first poems to pay for the train ride. He lived with a frum man on the outskirts of town, but there, for the first time in a more full way, engaged with secular Jewish culture and really appreciated his peers and some of his teachers, most of whom were not religious, but were very engaged in questions of justice, both for the Jewish community, advocating, for its own place within this complicated cultural political landscape and for others beyond the Jewish community. And he was really impressed by some of the peers and teachers that used their artistry, poetry and music and playwriting, to try and articulate messages of equity and justice. From there, he went to the University of Berlin. And tragically, he began his doctoral studies in 1933. And that was not the most significant thing that happened in Germany in 1933. Of course, Hitler came to power in 1933. And it was a very complicated time for Heschel, but also a very generative time. He studied at the University of Berlin. His doctoral dissertation was on the prophets. He minored in art history. He was attending various salons of Jewish intellectuals, including philosophers and psychotherapists and so forth and so on. He also went to two esteemed Berlin Jewish institutions of higher learning. One was Orthodox and one was Reform. And they were located, in fact, on a street called Arsenal. And most people did not go between the Hildesheimer Yeshiva and the Institute for the Scientific Study of Judaism. But that was who Heschel was for much of his life. He didn't quite fit neatly anywhere. And on the one hand, I think that was a part of why he became such a unique, thoughtful, transformative figure, but it also led to a good deal of loneliness throughout his life. In a complicated and painful way, he was not able to receive his doctoral dissertation until 1936 because Jewish books were not being published with ease anymore. And in order for one to receive a doctorate then and still now in many European universities, you have to publish it. In 1937, he worked for a short period of time with Martin Buber, who was a kind of mentor and adversary at the same time, like many of our relationships. Buber left for the land of Israel, for pre-state Palestine, because he was Martin Buber and had much greater ease in terms of travel. Heschel was still all but unknown. And so he remained in Germany, in Frankfurt, where he essentially replaced Buber as the co-director with another colleague of this Institute for Adult Jewish Study, which Buber had originally created with the late Franz Rosenzweig. In 1937, Heschel is unceremoniously booted out of Germany in the middle of the night. Police come to his door. They say, you have 1 hour to pack 2 bags. He's carted off back to the Polish border. Because his family is well known in Poland, they're able essentially to bribe the officials for his freedom. He's working very diligently to find a job as far from the Nazis as possible. In 1938, 1939, something quite astounding and miraculous for him happens, which is the president of Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati offers him a scholar's visa. You might remember that the United States, of course, did far too little, too late to save Jews in the Shoah, but there was a provision for scholars and cultural figures. There were very few visas that were given out to Jewish institutions and others. So there is a picture, I'll show it to you afterwards in the book that I just published from the American Jewish Archives, of a minyan, literally 10 scholars that were saved from the Nazis by Julius Morgenstern, the president of Hebrew Union College, sitting together in Cincinnati. Can you imagine what it must have been like to be one of those scholars? And in some cases, of course, like with Heschel, they came alone. Heschel's leaving his Hasidic community meant that he could earn a PhD. But the irony, the terrible irony, is almost all of his other family members were murdered. He sat Shiva at HUC between 1940 and 1945 4 times for immediate family members, 3 sisters and his mother. In 1945, he moves to New York. He found HUC just inappropriate for him as a person that was still quite traditional personally in terms of his practice. He didn't know that it was going to be glatt treif. In fact, he took almost all of his meals in his own room, and he had a small kitchenette. There were a small number of students that were very excited and saw themselves as disciples of his in a kind of neo-Hasidic Rebbe Chassid relationship, and the other students at HUC branded them the Piety Boys. Among them was, interestingly, Richard Rubinstein, who became very well known as a death of God theologian a few years later, and really struggled with the whole notion of a personal God that was still alive and present and meaningfully so in people's lives. Heschel moved to JTS. He spent the rest of his professional life in New York City. He was not at all at home at JTS either, because he was a chassid among misnagdim. He was a generalist among specialists. And the more political he became in the 1960s, the more he had support and honor from some, and opposition and disrespect from others, and a fair bit of jealousy too, because he became this nationally regarded figure. And so his life at JTS was quite painful. He was actually never allowed to teach courses on Kabbalah and Hasidism in the ways that he wanted for large groups of students. He had private studies and so forth and so on. In 1962, while hard at work on his translation and expansion of his doctoral dissertation, he made the following decision. Would someone read the middle of the page, the smaller font? This was immediately after finishing the Prophets. Yeah, the middle passage. Can you read it? It's not intended as an eye exam, but
I've written a book on the prophets.
Yes.
I spent many years completing it. And really, this book changed my life. Because early in my life, my great love was for learning, studying. And the place I preferred to live was my study. I've learned from the prophets that I have to be involved in the affairs of man, in the affairs of suffering humans.
So again, this is after the completion of the Prophets, which you probably know became a very important book to the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In fact, his translation of Amos and other passages from many of his most famous speeches were taken from Heschel's translations in the Prophets. One of the things that Heschel noticed much earlier, when he made his voyage by ship via England, where he lived with his brother who had escaped for a year, coming from there to the United States on a boat, that all of the people doing manual labor were black. When he arrived at Ellis Island, all of the people carrying baggage and sweeping floors and all of those jobs were people of color. And of course, this first several years he was in the United States, most of his energy went to simply acculturating, beginning his life as a scholar and teacher. His English was very poor when he arrived, but within 5 years he was writing quite beautiful prose in English. He truly was gifted with language. And then trying to save his family, which he also found incredibly painful because Jewish leaders in the American Jewish community also were not yet reckoning with just how significant the horrors were, including Stephen S. Wise and others that had places of prominence in relation to the U.S. government. So all of this was churning within him. He also fell in love. He was a bachelor for a long time. When he was the age of 39, turning 40, he married his wife Sylvia Strauss. Not accidentally, she was the child of immigrants from Nazi-occupied Europe. She was also a concert pianist. And so they reacquainted in New York. They married. They lived on Riverside Drive for the rest of his life. They had one child together. Sylvia and Abraham Joshua Heschel gave birth to Susanna Heschel, who's now a well-known scholar and feminist activist, etc. But it wasn't until the early 1960s where all of these life experiences, so many of them painful, distressing, disorienting, dislocating, led him to become the activist that we remember him to be. And among the things that he worked diligently for the rest of his life until 1972 were, of course, African American civil rights, Jewish-Christian reconciliation through the Second Vatican Council that convened from 1962 to 1965. And then, in some ways, most forcefully, was anti-Vietnam War activism. Dr. King and others drew Heschel into the civil rights movement. Heschel drew Dr. King and others into the peace movement. I'll say a little bit more about that in a few minutes. He died apparently peacefully on Shabbat with a kiss, as the rabbis describe it. He had a heart condition. Among the last things that he did, interestingly, was to go to Danbury, Connecticut, where there is a state prison, to welcome the Berrigan brothers, who had been imprisoned there. You remember the Berrigan brothers, Phil and Daniel Berrigan, who were these avowed pacifists, and I think by many accounts, heroic in their peace activist work. What is interesting about Heschel, and I try and write this in the book that I published, and I'll share it with you. The book is designed, in fact, for teens and young adults, because I think they need Heschel's voice perhaps more today than ever before, is that people like the Berrigans, with whom he was working very closely on peace efforts and anti-Vietnam War efforts, were much more thoroughgoing pacifists. Heschel was not. After the Shoah, he believed that there were times and places where military force was just absolutely necessary. You might remember that Buber had a similar exchange with Mahatma Gandhi about this issue. The other thing, too, is that Heschel increasingly became a Zionist. He was somewhat tepid about Zionism with the establishment of the State of Israel, as were a whole slew of other outstanding American and international Jewish leaders, including Rabbi Joseph Ber Soloveitchik, but many people in the Reform movement. And Heschel was concerned about what a Jewish national state would necessarily have to become. But after the 1967 war, like many other Jews in North America, he increasingly felt like he needed to articulate his support for the state, and he wrote a little book, a slim book called Israel, an Echo of Eternity. And it's an echo of eternity. And it was really designed in part to explain to the many Christians in his life, and the many Christians that were reading him, probably many more Catholics were reading him while he was alive than Jews, why Israel mattered to him, to the Jewish people, and as he understood it, to the world at large. It's fascinating because Phil and Daniel Berrigan, among others, were already chiding Heschel, not only on the issue of pacifism, but on the issue of the Palestinian people and the occupation of lands and so forth. And in the last pages of that book, Heschel attempts to address it. Of course, his situation was nothing like the situation today. So when people ask me, what would Heschel have said or done? I really think we all need to be modest and cautious about things like that. But in the closing pages of that book, he essentially says to Jews, to Israelis, to Muslims, to Arabs, we will either live together or we will die together. There really is no other choice. We all believe that this land is sacred, and he had hoped that those territorial gains would lead the Israeli government to a negotiated peace settlement. We continue to hope so too. But I raised that issue just because there were times and places where he was very much a gadfly. You'll see that in this telegram. He was, in fact, strident. He felt, that prophetic zeal coursing through him. And then he was also using language we would use, it was not yet in vogue then, was a kind of intersectional political and spiritual actor, and recognized we're not going to agree about everything. And yet he went to welcome the Berrigan brothers out of prison, about 12 days before he died. So I want to look at this telegram. You'll see it's from June 16th, 1963. And to me, it's really a classic, a modern classic Jewish religious text. Want to read it, Jacob?
Yes. Okay.
And again, with some of you in the room, I don't need to explain what a telegram was. When I'm teaching younger audiences, I say to them, think about it as a much more expensive text message in which people tended to be much more thoughtful than most of us now who just dash off these messages. Every letter and word and punctuation mark cost money. So you'll see the artistry of this spiritual activist at work here.
To President John F. Kennedy, the White House, June 16, 1963. Stop. I look forward to the privilege of being present at meeting tomorrow at 4 p.m. Stop. Likelihood exists that Negro problem will be like the weather. Stop. Everybody talks about it, but nobody does anything about it. Stop. Please demand of religious leaders personal involvement, not just solemn declaration. Stop. We forfeit the right to worship God as long as we continue to humiliate Negroes. Stop. Churches, synagogues have failed. Stop. They must repent. Stop. Ask of religious leaders to call for national repentance and personal sacrifice. Stop. Let religious leaders donate 1 month's salary toward fund for Negro housing and education. Stop. I propose that you, Mr. President, declare state of moral emergency. Stop. A Marshall Plan for aid to Negroes is becoming a necessity. Stop. The hour calls for moral grandeur and spiritual audacity.
Woo!
Amen.
Yes, yes.
So what do you hear? What do you see? What resonates with you? What feels like
I
it's...
love that this was a telegraph to the president. It's
Yes.
so informal. He's like, do this.
Well, let me give you some context. There was a meeting the next day that the Kennedy administration had organized for national religious leaders. There were probably 50 to 75 leaders that were to come to the White House by invitation for breakfast and a briefing by the Kennedy administration, including the president, on the African American civil rights situation. That too did not happen in a vacuum, because a week after that meeting, there was a scheduled meeting of the major leaders of the civil rights movement, including King, Abernathy, Bunch, all the others. Those folks were agitating for several years for a national march on Washington, which became, of course, the March on Washington. Were any of you there?
Who said it?
All right.
So you might remember
You wasn't that time?
most people today, like with so many other things, when it comes to these historical figures, romanticize. People think, oh, the Kennedy brothers, they must have immediately and fulsomely taken up the cause of African American civil rights. Not so. They were politicians. Remember, too, that JFK was the first elected Catholic. The United States was not a particularly hospitable place to Catholics either in our long and complicated history. JFK at this point was very focused on legislative change, which of course was absolutely important. But the leaders in the civil rights movement said, we need public demonstrations of support. And we need to do this in Washington, D.C. And he was very nervous about it. There was a lot of negotiation over that year until June, really, and the march was in August, as you remember. And he was afraid that if there was violence, it would not only further polarize, but it would empower those that were against legislative change. As it turned out, of course, it was a great triumph. It was completely peaceful. It was, at that time, the largest mass gathering of human beings in the United States. And it propelled the legislation that took place in 64 and 65. Tragically, of course, JFK's murder also played a role in that. But this is all in the air. Heschel, without saying so, is advocating on behalf of his new allies and friends, including King, who he met 6 months earlier for the first time at the first conference on race and religion in Chicago. Heschel was the opening speaker. King was the keynote closing speaker. Just, to give you some sense of Heschel's rhetoric, he opened that speech by talking about the fact that this was not the first conference on religion and race. The first conference on religion and race happened roughly at this time, but thousands of years ago, and the main participants in that summit meeting were a man named Moses and a man named Pharaoh. And then he goes on to say, in this kind of gadfly-like way, which he was so expert at, that he believed that it was easier for the children of Israel to cross the Sea of Reeds than it was for many African-American young men and women to cross college and university campuses. And then he went on to say, racism is an eye disease. So this is 6 months later, and this is Heschel becoming more and more involved, really feeling that the prophets demanded that he leave his study. He also studied Maimonides very carefully. Theologically, Maimonides was the main person with whom he was arguing constantly, because Maimonides proffered a notion theologically that God is not involved in the world providentially in the ways that many other classical Jewish theologians had argued. Olam keminhago omed. God sets the world in motion, and then it is a very naturalistic process, with some exceptions and some dissension in different texts. But Heschel, as he developed, talked about God as the most feeling of all beings. He described his theology as a theology of pathos, of feeling. He said more important than God's being all-knowing is God's being all-feeling. And the prophetic passages about, the divine weeping at the mistreatment of widows and orphans is something that just shuddered within. And of course, he was a person that experienced real poverty. The death toll during the First World War. When he was a graduate student, he lived through the Depression, and he lived mostly on potatoes and bread. That was all before Hitler. And then the atrocities of the Nazis. One of the things I often also say to people, which I think needs to be repeated, is that people that experience pain and suffering, people that are treated badly, people that are abused and traumatized, do not necessarily or regularly then grow into expansive, empathic people. And you could well understand that if he came to the United States and lived a much quieter, closed life of Torah teaching, of scholarship, of Jewish communal engagement. That's what most of his relatives did, including those that were still Hasidic. He had a first cousin whose name was Abraham Joshua Heschel, who married his sister, his older sister Sarah, and they were Hasidim. And they apparently were lovely people and took pride in him and always referred to him as the professor in the family, but chose a much more insular life. And he was compelled to act differently. It's one of the things, by the way, that I admire most about Reb Zalman, who for a time was very close with Heschel. He saw Heschel really as an informal guide, and there was a time where Heschel tried to arrange for Reb Zalman to work at the Jewish Theological Seminary. I'll save that for another time, but it's a rather comical story.
Before we go, I'm just
Yes.
aware that if there are people on live stream, they may not have heard Jacob reading. I just wonder if you could just read the telegram.
Why don't you read it? You're the actor.
No, but
Oh, so come on.
Come on. Okay. But I am curious, as Mark is rereading, what do you hear? What do you see? By the way, some people here may not know what the Marshall Plan was. Just what are you picking up? What feels resonant or strange or relevant?
Power in calling truth to be seen.
Okay, so speaking truth to power is certainly one piece.
how well known was he as a public intellectual at this time that he felt, even though he was invited to this, like, did he have the president's ear, or did he just dash this off?
He didn't have the president's ear in the way that King and others did, but he was a fairly well-known public religious intellectual. In the 1950s, his work was celebrated by, among others, Reinhold Niebuhr, who was the great Protestant theologian of the era. And Niebuhr also was well respected by political figures because much of his work was on ethics and so forth and so on.
What year was the Prophets published?
The Prophets was 62. So, and King and others were already quoting from him. Let justice roll down. That's Heschel's translation, which King, of course, delivered so eloquently and powerfully at the March on Washington. By the way, he wasn't planning on delivering that speech, which he had been rehearsing in other cities, but Mahalia Jackson at a certain point called out and said, "Martin, tell them about the dream." And then he switched. And part of his genius, as an orator was that he could do that. But none of it was just on the fly either, which people often confuse.
So if he could read it.
You want to read it again?
So that everybody hears.
Beautiful.
Michael, after you read it, because I have a question.
Great.
This.
Great.
I'd rather have the rabbi read it.
Yeah.
So again, if those of you on live stream didn't get to hear when Rav Jacob read this, we're just going to read it again. It's important to have two rabbis reading it. You don't have the text, so this is, what year was the telegram? It was
63. He'll announce it.
Right. So, to President John F. Kennedy, the White House, June 16, 1963. Stop. I look forward to the privilege of being present at meeting tomorrow at 4 p.m. Stop. Likelihood exists that Negro problem will be like the weather. Stop. Everybody talks about it, but nobody does anything about it. Stop. Please demand of religious leaders personal involvement, not just solemn declaration. Stop. We forfeit the right to worship God as long as we continue to humiliate Negroes. Stop. Churches, synagogues have failed. Stop. They must repent. Stop. Ask of religious leaders to call for national repentance and personal sacrifice. Stop. Let religious leaders donate 1 month's salary toward fund for Negro housing and education. Stop. I propose that you, Mr. President, declare state of moral emergency. Stop. A Marshall Plan for aid to Negroes is becoming a necessity. Stop. The hour calls for moral grandeur and spiritual audacity.
I'm getting in line.
Yeah.
After it.
Ed.
I find this letter difficult because here we have a religious leader demanding the president to have other religious leaders stand up. A president who made it very clear that because he didn't make any movement because the Democrats, he knew that they would lose the Democratic base. But to ask a president of the United States to demand something of religious leaders in a country that's supposed to be separation of church and state is like the letter to me is split. The other stuff about the Marshall Plan and the other things is more appropriate to ask of a president. It's like the first part should have been asked of somebody else. That's all. I was always struck by that kind of dichotomy in for me in the letter.
Right. So just to repeat, so others could hear it, I'll summarize. Ed was saying that he feels some discomfort with the letter. There are elements of it that feel like they're beautiful, just, and appropriate, but should a public religious leader and scholar be calling on the President of the United States, who is charged with upholding the separation of church and state, to demand of other religious leaders that they act in particular ways, also understanding the political landscape at the time and the suspicion, that many still held of JFK being a Catholic. Heschel did, of course, understand and very much appreciated the need for the separation of church and state. My dear friend, another scholar and teacher on Heschel, Rabbi Shai Held, often describes Heschel as being intentionally hyperbolic. That is, it's a mode of discourse. Remember, he comes from a long line of sermonizers. and he read the prophets very carefully. And so, stylistically, what he was trying to do was to be dramatic and to try and inspire and goad and so forth. He knew he was not going to get all that he was asking for. I think the best way to state it is that he's trying to raise the consciousness, and there is some fuzziness here. That is, as a written document, decades later, I too feel some discomfort. I often say to people, when I read things like this from Heschel or King, of course, I'm energized. But if it came from Billy Graham or fill in the blanks, it would make me quite uncomfortable. So the question of, what are the lines, Ed, I think is absolutely appropriate. Ultimately, he and figures like King, felt like their task in the model of the prophets was to advocate for different kinds of change, knowing that in the separation of powers, others would decide. But there is a kind of, rhetorical play here, and there is a kind of hyperbole that he often uses. But he's also, a poetic, prophetic voice. And so it's a zetz, to put it in fanciful terms.
Yeah, so I'd like to say why I don't have a problem with this at all.
Good.
What I love about it, and I'd like to just pick a couple of things in particular. First of all, it sets a different bar for me about what moral grandeur and spiritual audacity is. This is a living example.
Mm-hmm.
This is a fiery, zealous, kuf nun aleph kind of power that is an important part of our prophetic and Jewish tradition. And how to use that in the world is tricky. So the first thing I want to say is the bitachon of this man, to be able to put this forward. I have just fallen, I've never read this before, I've fallen in love with him in a whole new way. And so starting with when he says, this is very interesting to me, everybody talks about it, but nobody does anything about it. So I want to say, I can't do anything about the weather. And almost implicit of this is him naming that there's a systemic power that people are helpless against. It's not explicit, but implicitly, it's like saying, how do you do something about it that's so entrenched in policies and laws that you can talk about it, but how do you do something about it? And how do you shake up a systemic power that is so entrenched? And we're going to learn more and more about this in the next couple of years.
Right.
And so I love the way he's kind of like putting that out there, that there's actually something so deep here, nobody knows what to do about it. How are you going to cut through that? You're going to cut through it through moral ferocity.
Right. Now, it is interesting, just to add to your comments, that he implicates himself. That is, churches and synagogues, Jewish and Christian leaders have failed. And he knows, again, he's winking here, Ed, that there's going to be a room full of very esteemed religious leaders who all can talk and talk and talk and talk. But no, what are we going to do? And so he does become more concrete. That is, it's about personal sacrifice.
It's about repentance.
It's about,
that's the second point.
right, it's about concretizing that sense of devotion, of worship, of position, of power. More so than that, right? It's 1 month's salary toward very specific things. Housing and education. What was the march in Washington to be called? For jobs and freedom. And that was very, very important. That there was a sense that it wasn't just a broad gathering, but it had to be specific as it related to the systemic inequalities of this country. So he's signaling, because he knows that JFK is going to be meeting with these leaders. The other thing, too, you remember the Marshall Plan. After the Second World War, the United States led this massive multi-billion-dollar effort to rebuild Europe, including Germany. If they could do that, Heschel is saying, what about the centuries of destruction and devastation that African Americans have experience in this country? Can we put some real weight behind that? He doesn't use the word reparations, but he is calling for a systemic financial investment here for housing and education.
Basic human dignity.
Right. Yes, yes, and yes.
Just a clarification, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
But he's saying nothing was going on. That's not really true. JFK was already agitated.
Yes.
The Civil Rights Act was passed in '64, and he was meeting with the black leaders. So there was something under.
Yeah.
It wasn't.
No.
It kind of bothers me when somebody at that stature doesn't really get the facts exactly right.
He knew that. He's not saying nothing was happening. I mean, JFK just days earlier had given a speech on television that he watched very carefully.
I think what he's saying in this Telegraph is that religious leaders
Right.
don't do anything about the problem.
Right.
But I think they were doing it as well.
Yeah, he's, again, remember, this is a kind of prophetic message. It's meant as a zetz.
Right.
It's meant to say, we're gathering tomorrow. Now is the time. Et la asod.
And it's sort of sermonizing.
Exactly,
You do
exactly.
that, you have to purpose.
Yes, exactly. Yes, he watched JFK, as did the nation. He gave a major address on civil rights, but he still was being very careful. Bobby Kennedy, too, was meeting regularly, trying to negotiate and navigate. One really good treatment of this is the recent film on Bayard Rustin. Rustin, who, is this incredibly brave person, including, of course, being a gay man. And that, that piece of the story, including his essential role in the March on Washington, you see illustrated, including all of the negotiations that happened until the very last moments, because a young John Lewis and the students really wanted to hammer away at the government. And you might remember, in the 11th hour, the group was working on editing Lewis's speech that he was going to give to moderate it, which many students didn't appreciate. Particularly as it related to JFK, to MLK, because they thought that he was too accommodating.
And it was also politically dicey for these people to step out.
Exactly.
I mean, look what happened with Johnson. He lost the whole Senate.
Right.
by the civil rights.
Right. So again, though, he is saying different people need to play different roles. If I'm a rabbi, if I've spent the last many years writing on the prophets, what is mine now to do? And many times I ask people when working with the material, so what do you feel called to do? Particularly younger people. You don't need to be Heschel. You don't need to be MLK. You don't need to necessarily be a frontline activist. There are other ways to contribute. But I think it's an important question. What role did he see himself playing? Yes?
So there's two things that stand out for me. The first one, repent. The idea of you must repent.
Yes.
So speaking to what Ed brought up and what we've been talking about, if you substitute the word, they must be accountable.
Right.
That sounds more like civil discourse, right?
Right.
But that's really what he's saying. He's saying it in that more fiery way.
Yes.
And the other thing that really speaks to me is this idea of spiritual audacity.
Uh-huh.
And my husband's yard site is this week,
Mm.
and so in his honor, I want to repeat something he would always say.
Please.
When he'd be learning anything Jewishly, his test always was, well, how is this going to make me a better person?
Yes.
And if it wasn't, he had no use for it.
Right.
If it was something like, some long diatribe proving that God gave us the Torah, like, okay, but what do I do with that? How does
Yes.
it make me better? So translating that into what are you going to do with it? And I think there's a lot of unstated things, as you were saying, this is a cliff notes of what
Yes.
you're really trying to say here. I mean, there's themes that aren't stated of collaboration,
Mm-hmm.
how the church collaborated
Yes.
in World War II.
Oh, absolutely.
Bystander.
Yes.
We're going to do nothing. We're just going to talk about it and do nothing.
Exactly.
And you're part of the problem.
Yes.
And the failure post-Civil War
Yes.
for things to work out. So he's invoking a new idea. Okay, let's call it a Marshall Plan instead.
Right.
So we need to do what we never did before.
Right. And to go back to the issue of his...
Oh, will you summarize?
Yeah. So, I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Karen. Part of what Karen was saying is that you could think about, different terminology. and how might that sound or land to us here and now, and why did he choose particular terms? I think, by the way, some of the religious language he's using, because he knows that the Kennedys do identify as a Catholic family and are familiar with this kind of language. So he's trying to, play different sides of the coin, so to speak. The other thing to go to, what was his public, profile at that point, everyone knew that this man embodied, old world wisdom. He spoke in a thick Eastern European accent, the long beard, the beautiful writings on, virtually every area of classical Jewish thought. Young people in the civil rights movement began to call him Father Abraham. There are, a disproportionate number of African Americans who started to wear kippot at the Montgomery, Selma to Montgomery March, etc. So his public profile was growing. And yes, the issue of bystander is very significant without having to say so. I want to say one word here about Heschel's attempts at holism, because I think that's very important, really important to go back to my first question about today. Should we be here or should we be, downtown marching? Read what he says, the second quotation that I included. This is in a letter that he sent to MLK after the march the following year from Selma to Montgomery. Someone, again, for whom this is not...
Maybe someone go up.
I'll do it.
Thank you.
For many of us, the march from Selma to Montgomery was about protest and prayer. Legs are not lips, and marching is not kneeling, and yet our legs uttered songs. Even without words, our march was worship. I felt my legs were praying.
So I felt my legs were praying has become something that people quote or misquote regularly, including my feet were praying. Turn the page because I want you to see the visual. On the left-hand side, you see the famous picture. This is a slightly different angle of that same picture of Heschel, Ralph Bunche pointing forward in King and Abernathy, and that's the cover of my book. To the right is a picture, as I said, of Heschel's uncle, the Novominsker Rebbe, one of the Novominsker's Hasidim. And I got that picture from one of Heschel's nephews, who's named after this Rebbe who lives in New Jersey and interestingly is a psychotherapist. A Rebbe by some other name is still a Rebbe. But look at those two images of people walking. Because what Heschel said in a diary entry is that when I marched from Selma to Montgomery, it reminded me of marching through the streets very proudly with my uncle and other Hasidic Rebbes. That there was a nobility to what was happening. There was a kind of spiritual audacity, if you will, that you cannot separate life in the Beit Knesset or in the Beit Midrash from life in the street. That's what he's saying. My legs were praying. How would a chassid say this? I think they would say, I'm engaging in avodah begashmiut, devotion through physicality. But what is amazing about Heschel relative to the Hasidim, of course, is that he was able to apply that not to the little oilam of the Degel Machaneh Ephraim, the Jewish world, but to the much bigger world. A much bigger and more dangerous world in which Jews were often mistreated. And he's saying, no, if I'm going to do this, it has to be for the sake of all of humankind. And that's an amazing thing. But you see the Hasidic, prophetic mind and heart at work. He was unusual in that way. My legs were praying. By the way...
Didn't you get that originally from Frederick Douglass, that phrase?
My legs were praying?
Frederick Douglass, the black abolitionist, used that same phrase. And I've heard that Heschel...
I don't know if that's the exact phrasing. I haven't heard that before, but I would be happy to learn that if that is the case.
Same idea.
Because it would make it even more powerful if there's an American, and especially civil rights.
I think I have it.
Yeah, you don't have to look for it now, but I would love to see it. But this is a translation. I don't mean translation in the narrow sense. That, in fact, I think is Heschel's greatest gift. is that he was a translator par excellence. He was very selective, right? He wasn't going to abide as a chassid, but he wanted to take the best of classical Jewish literature and living and bring it to a much broader audience. And he felt like Judaism had something to say to the world. So, for example, right, when he talks about Shabbat, just to hold the tension between Shabbat and Chol, davening, learning, and protesting, right, he says Shabbat is now more important than ever. Why? Because we are living after the development of the most sophisticated modern civilization in the history of humankind, in which what was developed? The most lethal killing machines. And as an antidote to the Second World War and to the Holocaust, I think one has to read the Sabbath as a post-Holocaust theological treatise. He's saying we need Shabbat more than ever. Not just us, the Jewish world.
Who's read the Sabbath? If you haven't, it's the most amazing introduction to history.
Yeah.
Well, I have a question. Did President Kennedy act on this? And if not, did Heschel have a chance to address this big gathering of religious leaders and tell them this?
Yeah, I mean, JFK was already, working towards this, and a whole series of other events contributed to it. He didn't act on this specifically. And then, of course, the tragedy is, who knows what would have been had he lived. Heschel didn't address this with the group the next day, but he became more and more prominent in the civil rights movement. Another sad thing was that King and family were supposed to celebrate Pesach with the Heschels in 1968. Heschel really wanted King to be at his Seder. He referred to King as the Moses of our generation. At Heschel's 60th birthday, 65th birthday, in 1965, so I guess he was, however old he was,
58.
Yeah, maybe so. It was maybe 62. It was at his 60th birthday. He was celebrated by the body of the conservative rabbinate, and he asked that Dr. King be the keynote speaker. And in that speech, he said of Dr. King, "If you want to know where God is today in the United States, hearken to the voice of Martin Luther King Jr." And Everett Gendler, is that name familiar to some of you?
Focusing guy.
He was a wonderful justice, peace, environmental Jewish leader. Introduced Dr. King that evening. So there are a lot of question marks of what would have happened had some of these people lived longer lives, but they didn't. In fact, in the last interview that Heschel gave, from which I'm quoting in the middle of the page, which I think is also important for us to remember, Carl Stern, the interviewer from NBC, it was a part of JTS's Eternal Light series. I don't know if you remember that, but he said to Heschel, "Your friend King was murdered. The Kennedy brothers were murdered. You've been involved in all of this activism. What is it for? You've written all of these beautiful books about, the prophetic legacy." And you could just see the weight that Heschel is bearing. And then he says, "Do I have to tell you that life is not linear?"
Oh, nice answer.
Yeah. But you could just see,
Is that the expression he used?
yeah. You can see the full transcript of the interview.
You can watch the full interview.
Yeah, you can also watch the full interview.
It's
Have you
very
seen
good.
it?
I
Yeah.
saw it in Warsaw.
And
How do I access it?
it's easy. Just look for Carl Stern interview or Eternal Lights interview with Heschel. It actually aired after Heschel died. It was his last interview. But the whole transcript too you could read. Susanna put together a book called Moral Grandeur and Spiritual Audacity, which are about 25 essays
So good.
that hadn't been published in his lifetime. And she has a very helpful foreword, and there are footnotes and such. And she includes this as essentially the frontispiece to the book. Yeah, Ed.
I have a different question. You said we we don't know what Heschel would have said or done regarding Israel. We do know a couple of things. When he was teaching at the time of the Deir Yassin massacre, he canceled class. And he also said that Israel had to do something regarding the sorrow of and the pain and suffering of the Palestinians. He addressed the issue in that way. So based on those two things, I'm just wondering what Heschel what he would be doing when we have terrorists and Israeli terrorists as civilians and soldiers that just go and murder Palestinians in their villages and burn their homes, and terrorize them. I'm just, this has always been. I know there's a lot of writings on what Heschel might have done, but he did that one thing. He did a couple things.
I just don't think it's responsible of me to try and speculate, because I was surprised by some of the directions that his contemporaries took in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, 2000s. Just different people that collaborated with him took very different directions on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, on domestic issues. So I just can't predict, and I don't know that it's helpful. I think what we can do is say, if we're thoughtful and serious about the writings, can we apply the principles to contemporary situations, but do so with a measure of humility, which is to say, like any great figure, they're going to be understood differently. I already see it happening with Reb Zalman. He's only been dead for 10 years, and people, in very self-assured ways say, this is how Reb Zalman did it or would have done it. And I say, wait a moment. That's not quite how I experienced the person. Even his decision to write Israel, an Echo of Eternity was somewhat surprising based on the relative absence of Israel in his public writings and speaking. So he himself grew and evolved.
Did he visit Israel much?
Yes, he visited Israel several times. I have a really wonderful picture of him, his wife, and his daughter in front of a El Al plane. But it's interesting about Israel too, theologically, and this may be a part of the answer. But he did not believe that Eretz Yisrael as a land was more or less holy than any other piece of land. Remember, Heschel was the theologian par excellence of his generation of time. Shabbat, right, is holiness in time. He truly believed that the fixation with things of space was very corrosive. That was part of the post-Holocaust theology. He said people have become, in the post-industrial age, so attached to things of space that we completely ignored, the realm of time at our own peril. And he said, by building more and more firewalls, we will not become immortal. By building bigger and bigger arsenals, right, we will not protect ourselves from, the realities of our limited time on this earth. And he says it very clearly in Israel as an Echo of Eternity. What makes Israel holy are all of the experiences of the Jewish people, right? From the period of the Tanakh onward. It echoes through time. It was a very deliberate choice. It's different than some of the other Jewish religious thinkers, religious Zionist thinkers before him and of his age. So, if we're thinking about how to apportion land, for example, I think he is an important voice. And in other regards too, let's look at what he did write about U.S. governmental policy or the war in Vietnam, etc., etc. His understanding of international law, human rights. there I think we could, have some clues, but I'm going to remain cautious. I'm not going to exercise moral grandeur and spiritual audacity in trying to apply the lessons of a man that died in 1972 and 2025. But I want to be disturbed by him. I want to be roused by him. I really want to engage in a process of what his ancestors would call berur, which is discernment. Okay, here I am, here we are. The world is both beautiful and broken. And so what are we going to do about it? One of Heschel's favorite midrashim, by the way, I've been repeating it, I think every day that I've been at Europa in different ways, because I feel like it's really, instead of grumbling within me, it's from Bereshit Rabbi. And I probably shared it with you at school, a dozen times or more. But in God in Search of Man, he quotes this midrash from Bereshit Rabbi, in which, Rabbi Yitzchak asks, based on God's call to Avram, Lech Lecha, to whom can Avram be compared? And the answer is to a person that's walking through the wilderness and comes upon a birah doleket. And a birah doleket can be translated, as Heschel did and other earlier commentators, either as a palace on fire or a palace that is full of light, that is aglow. And the end of the mashal goes as follows. Abram sees this. Abram says, "Is there no Baal Habirah?" Right? He's so taken with this vision. And that moment, the Baal Habirah appears out and says, "I am the master of this palace." And then, right, the nimshal is, this is like Abram wandering through the world seeking God. And I think that Heschel liked it for a few different reasons. First of all, because in my paraphrase of it, the world is a birah doleket. It is both beautiful and broken. Right? Heschel was the master of radical amazement. On the other hand, he saw the horrors of human barbarity. And so the birah doleket is about holding that truth, that complex truth. You can't begin to act unless you see, that things are both beautiful and ugly. The other thing is, at the end of that mashal, it isn't like the master of the palace emerges and says, "Yes, and I am in full control, and this is my plan, and you can just relax." No, the way that Heschel understands it, of course, is this is God in search of man. This is the subtle but real call of the divine to each of us in the depths of our beings to be shutafim, right? To use that rabbinic term, to be partners in creating, the just, compassionate, sustainable world that God wants to see. It's why Heschel said, though ultimately unsatisfying, of course, probably to him too, but the question is not where was God in Auschwitz, but where was man? Right? If God gives human beings free will, if God lets go of a certain degree of control of the world, then horrible things can come to pass. And I think he was trying to live in that tension for the rest of his life. You can ask other theological questions, including, okay, thank you for freedom, but maybe a little less freedom and a little less, disease, famine, plague, etc. But that's the knot that Heschel was trying to tease out. By the way, that's why his student Richard Rubinstein said after the Holocaust, the God of classical Judaism, who's a personal God providentially involved in life, is dead. And Rubinstein said, whether that's ontologically true or not, how could we say anything else? Heschel modified that. In fact, he didn't like when younger students like Art Green or others quoted Rubinstein or paraphrased Rubinstein or even raised Rubinstein's name. Because for Heschel, somehow that was just too much. But he would say, don't articulate anything theologically that you would not be willing to say while standing before children that had been burned in crematoria. So, all of that he was trying to hold. And, this is why, for me, I don't know, I've probably taught this text 200 times. When he says, we forfeit the right to worship God as long as we continue to humiliate Negroes, is so powerful. Mm-hmm. After all, this is the person that wrote the Sabbath. This is the person that writes so beautifully about prayer and ritual. And people, often misunderstand this kind of prophetic language. It's not either or. It's both. Right? He's not suggesting stop praying, stop studying Torah, stop lighting candles, stop, all of the ritual elements of Jewish life. He was one of the most eloquent spokespersons for such things. And by the way, he did not go to the Selma to Montgomery March on Shabbat. I've heard some people say that. No, he left Motzei Shabbat specifically. He said, I will not come on Shabbat. I'm not suggesting that, we or others not go to marches on Shabbat, but just hold it. That is, there's a yin and a yang. And he would not go. And part of what he thought was so remarkable about the young people, like Andrew Young, who actually was once young, and John Lewis, that they welcomed him and they were so hospitable. It wasn't safe, but they went and they drove to and from and they treated him with tremendous respect. He loved and so appreciated that in the prayer service for the leaders of the march before setting out, that Dr. King specifically chose passages, from the Tanakh and not from the New Testament. All of those elements that go into creating thoughtful, humane, inviting coalitions. Another question related to today is, could this action happen on a Monday or a Wednesday or a Thursday? Or a Sunday. I mean, again, I don't know the answer to such things. There are times where I've gone to marches or protests on Shabbat or Chagim, and times where I just feel like, no, this is Shabbos, and I'm unresolved. So I'm just sharing it with you as part of the process.
I just got a memory, that phrase about we forfeit the right to pray while humiliating Negroes. One of the most awful places in 2012 I was in Ghana. We went to this slave castle on the Cape Coast of Ghana, which was the biggest processing of slaves in that whole industry. And
It's in your song.
there is...
Yeah.
What?
I'll comment afterwards. He's referencing something, that...
Well, I'm
Yeah.
just saying that in 2012 I was in Ghana with a group of rabbis and AJWS. We went to the slave castle on Cape Coast in Ghana, and there is where the male dungeon was, where literally naked male Africans were chained. Above it there was a trap door that was inside the church where the slave masters were praying, and they were could open the trap door and make sure there was nothing, and it's just like. And the other thing is, where the SS officers would say mass in Auschwitz. It's like these two things.
Right.
On Psalm 137.
137. Yeah, so I'm working, and Jacob's been helping me. Now he's otherwise occupied, but on a collection of commentaries by people from different religious traditions on Sefer Tehillim, on the Book of Psalms. And among them is a piece, thank you for reminding me of it, Jacob, by a contemporary of ours, an African-American woman, religious leader in Philadelphia, and she, on the occasion of her 50th birthday, went back to Africa, and she was trying to think about what it all would mean for her, and she went exactly to that place. And she said it was the first time where she could understand the rage of the psalmist in Psalm 137. Where there's this very brutal call for retribution. She said, I would never want to act on it, but seeing gallows for children made me understand just the... and there's a lot of rage in the world right now. And how do we work with that energy? And we, the Jewish people, are still very much working that out too. We are not immune from it. That is just a part of our reality. Regardless of what policies we advocate for, I think, as Reb Tirza would remind us, the intergenerational trauma is still moving through us.
Well, this is the other point I wanted to say back from the telegram.
Yeah.
That really moved me. And something I'm thinking a lot about because we're in Leviticus.
Yeah.
And Leviticus gives clues of ancient practices to work with our shame.
Yeah.
And then modern practices, and now we need even more new practices. Yeah. But when he calls for repentance, for that teshuvah,
yeah.
What I want to say about that, I think that's a key to this situation because we're not going to start to unwind it until we get to the emotions of what it means to other somebody to that level.
Right.
And that deep, deep shame that our left brain does not want to acknowledge is at the key of that repentance. Mm-hmm. And so as I've been studying this word with my work with Sarah Yehudi Schneider, and she reminds me that Boshet, Teshuv, and then I will now add Shabbat, all have the same letters. Mm-hmm. We could do a whole understanding of just looking at those three letters to help us understand how do we go into the emotional territory without crumbling, standing tall, finding that Teshuvah, that call for Teshuvah, it can only happen on the emotional level. Mm-hmm. If we're going to find the emotionality of God, we have to find our own emotionality and figure out how to sit in that fire. Mm-hmm. And so I think as we're talking about this, and I'm literally working now with a progressive clergy in Boulder County, I have gone to meetings saying, what is our moral responsibility right now? And that was what we talked about at the meeting on that I'm hoping I can pull you guys into this because we're going to create a World Cafe, a progressive clergy here in Boulder that I am organizing so we can sit down and say, what is our moral responsibility right now? How do we do this? How do we include the emotionality? Because I think we're at a very similar spot right now.
Right. The one thing I would just ask you to keep in heart and mind, and I'm trying to do the same because I'm struggling with everyone else in this terribly complicated moment, is just to expect that you're going to disagree about certain issues.
Of course.
I want to say it out loud.
Okay.
If it was of course, I think we'd be living in a very different reality.
No, for me it's of course.
Right, but I want to say it out loud since I have the microphone, as it were, here, because I think it's a very complicated endeavor. Even the expression progressive clergy. Progressive on which issues? Progressive relative to what, continuum. And I would self-identify as being liberal or progressive, but I think especially in the midst of the Israeli-Palestinian horrors of the last 2 years, we've also learned that people are progressive or more conservative on different issues for different reasons. And that's why I'm taking the time to say it, because unless we're also working through the emotionality of that, we're going to just further tear apart. I think good people, thoughtful people, caring people can approach Israel-Palestine or any other significant issue from different perspectives. I'll just give you one simple example. It's not you, but I'm just responding to the language itself. 2 weeks ago, I had the bracha. It really was a blessing. I felt so honored to have two of the leaders from Shorashim, from Roots, the organization, in the West Bank in Israel. One an Orthodox settler, and the other a Palestinian Muslim leader. And to my surprise, Rabbi Hanan Schlesinger, when asked by some students, what's your ultimate vision of Israel-Palestine? He said, my ultimate vision is of a confederation. I'm not interested in one state, I'm not interested in two states. I'm interested in a confederation. And then, people could go between. You could have Israeli or Palestinian passports, but you could have local identity cards and be involved in civic affairs and so forth and so on. And it was just so disarming. Who could accuse him of either not being loyal or patriotic or working every single day for peace and justice for these two peoples? It's not my vision. I'm now going to think about it further. I know some people in Israel and the U.S. that are involved in such questions and advocacy for that possibility. He also did say, which I thought was tragic but also honest of him, that he has no expectation that will come to pass in his lifetime. But he said, if you really want to know what I think, and he said, because I actually do think the whole land is holy. He said, in that sense, I'm much more traditional or conservative than the other people around the table. He would assume, and I think he was right. But politically, and based relationally on his experience in this group, so do many other Palestinians think that every inch of this land is sacred. So he says, so this is my dream. I just raise it, not because I'm advocating, not because I'm an expert geopolitically, but it's just interesting to hear from people with whom we agree, with whom we disagree. That's why, to me, and my wife has taught me this, I think, in a profound way, that the term intersectionality is not just something to be bandied about, right, left, and center, but to be thought of very deeply as an acknowledgement that we're going to agree and we're going to disagree, and that we are going to intersect. And then the question is, can we still treat each other humanely when we disagree? And that's just not the norm now. So I wanted to just surface that, and that's why I gave the illustration of Heschel and the Berrigan brothers. I'm sure it pained him so deeply that they were not supportive of Israel in the ways that he thought was absolutely urgent. And they were probably, saddened and disappointed that this great prophetic Jewish leader held different views. And that's not easy. That's not simple. And I don't think we've learned how to do that very well.
I'm wondering, sort of, I guess I'll spread that live stream. On the note of trying to find collaboration and hold that we will disagree with each other in a very difficult way, I think like a feeling that has come up a lot in the past couple of years among youth trying to figure out how to work together is a feeling of betrayal, like
right.
Jews feeling betrayed by other leftists, black people feeling betrayed by Jews.
Right.
Everybody's sort of like accusing each other of betraying what they assumed was common cause.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm curious, in Heschel's life, how he felt he related to the rest of the Jewish community or the Jewish mainstream. People in my generation often say he taught at JTS, but nobody at JTS supported him, and I don't know how true that is or isn't. So I'm just curious.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm just going to read you one passage because this is the page I worked the hardest on in the whole book. And we can wind down because I don't have a rabbi that wants a shul on Shabbos. As soon as I come down from the adrenaline of this, I'll also crack. Here, Jacob, is a response. Heschel's 25 years, I'll pass it around so you can see it. Heschel's 25 years at JTS were rewarding, but also challenging. While he was more aligned with his New York colleagues than those in Cincinnati in terms of Jewish observance, other differences created painful distance. Heschel was an unconventional scholar and writer. He wrote several books for broad audiences, while other prominent JTS scholars wrote for fellow experts. He also focused much more of his writing on theology, the study of the relationship between God, humankind, and the world, from the Greek for theos, God, and logos, speech. while his seminary peers largely concentrated on Jewish history, language, and law. Heschel's Hasidic background and passion for Jewish mystical teachings also set him apart from several other JTS faculty who were raised in Jewish communities in Eastern and Central Europe that existed in tension with Hasidism. Finally, as Heschel became increasingly involved in social justice issues in the last decade of his life, he received significant public attention. His strong stances and growing media presence drew a range of responses from his peers, including agreement, support, and pride, but also disagreement, opposition, and jealousy. For all of the above reasons, Heschel found himself at odds with various colleagues, including some institutional leaders. These rifts were painful to him personally and also limited his leadership opportunities within the institution. I did not want to engage in rechilut or lashon hara. And it is true, I don't think that he was treated with the kind of respect that we might hope and expect today. And at the same time, he was also making choices about what he was saying publicly, and some people, of course, genuinely disagreed with him. But I think it might be helpful to say to ourselves and to others, he struggled. Not to romanticize. It was difficult for him. His involvement in the Vatican, the Vatican Council between 62 and 65 was incredibly difficult, and he lost his cool, and he, was not a particularly good religious diplomat at certain points. And so I tried to articulate some of that complexity without being schmutzadik or, just sort of engaging in kind of gossipy tales. But it was partially successful as far as he understood it, with a lot of different pressures. But I think you're right, Jacob. I don't know what the answer is, but I feel it. I feel it within our own school community, that people somehow are feeling bruised and beaten up or beaten down, and betrayal is a part of it. How could you do that, or how could you say that? And there's a lot of calling out. And I think we need more calling in, which is, okay, I'm struggling with this. And you could say, yeah, this hurts me. I'll just say, at the risk of, being too personal, but I think it's helpful. When we were singing Achenu earlier, there was a piece of me that thought, of course, and my heart is so broken for the hostages. Could we also include a prayer for Palestinians or not? And why? And I don't want to leap to assumptions, and I'm sure the community has had a process and so forth and so on. But someone could walk in and then pass judgment, or if you didn't say that, I just feel like anything and everything that people are trying to do with good intentions can be misunderstood, and oftentimes people are just ready to slug it out. And to me, that's incredibly painful. And I want to try and work on it with other good, thoughtful people. And I don't have the answers, but in my 20s, I published a book called Righteous Indignation, A Jewish Call for Justice. And there are a variety of interesting essays in there, and it was really a call to the progressive Jewish community to articulate our religious values. Today, I don't think I would ever entitle a book Righteous Indignation, because I've seen in myself and in many other people the slippage between righteous indignation and self-righteousness.
That's right.
Like there was a moment this morning, why did Rabbi Mark and Rabbi Jacob and the ritual community decide on this? And then I said, I have no idea. And I'm going to just be present to this moment because this piece is, feels real and important. And then at some point I'll ask, and, why does my synagogue do what it does? No one is intending to hurt or to anger, or to alienate or betray, as far as I know.
It was great.
Thank you all. I have 2 copies for Jacob and for Mark, but if you want to take a look, you can, and I'm going to ask them to purchase some copies and share them with you. If you know young people especially that would be interested in this, please let them know that it's available. I think we need models like this more than ever. Good
Thank
job.
you.
Thank you.